Welcome to the Fortnight for Freedom Conference. I'm Father Robert Spitzer, and I'm honored to be your first speaker this morning, even though I have to do this by videotape. The conference, of course, is dedicated to natural rights of human beings and looking at religious freedom in light of those natural rights. My talk this morning is going to be looking at the background of natural rights. And interestingly enough, that background comes more or less from the Catholic Church. And we'll talk about that, but also talk about our freedoms in light of the Constitution, our freedoms in light of the philosophy that our founding fathers in this country had in mind. So if you bear with me for the next 50 minutes, what I think I can do is put a context to our conference, taking a look at pro-life issues, taking a look at religious freedom, taking a look at natural rights, putting these three great fulcrums of our culture and Constitution together in a way that I think will make sense for our country and our culture going into the future. My approach is going to be from the two major pro-life issues, that is to say from the anti-abortion issue, from the anti-active euthanasia issue, which I'll be talking about as I go through what I'm going to call 10 universal principles. But many of you may be wondering, how is it as pro-life people that we've gotten ourselves seemingly into the position that we're in today in our culture? I mean, how many of you have been at least made to feel that you are sort of retroactive? How many of you have been made to feel that perhaps you're restricting rights instead of protecting rights, or taking away rights rather than vouchsafing rights? I mean, how many of you are just scratching your heads as you get up in the morning and go, how in the world can people not see the validity of our issue, that you can't go around killing innocent human beings, that you can't go around, advocating the suicide of elderly people who still have a high quality of life to live simply because they don't know that their fear and their depression and their physical pain symptoms can be treated. How did we get into this position? It seems so backwards, seems so confusing. And I think this has occurred through what I would call a very interesting strategy. A strategy, by the way, that's been taking place in our culture, not just with respect to the pro-life issues, but with respect to our educational system, starting in primary and secondary school, and certainly going all the way through the collegiate and graduate levels, taking place in our judiciary system, taking place too in the halls of governance. And so all of a sudden you're saying, well, Spitzer, what kind of changes has been occurring? In my view, it's the undermining of the 10 universal principles upon which our culture was founded. See, our founding fathers actually believed in some form of objective truth. And there's a really good reason for believing that there is such a thing as objective truth, a truth that we can all share together, a truth which is not merely subjective, a truth which isn't just a mere matter of opinion, so that, as it were, the strongest opinion by writ of influence or power wins the day, but the most truthful opinion, the one that is the truth, wins the day. The second thing our founding fathers believed in was the notion of objective ethics. Believe it or not, they believed that there was a right and a wrong that people could together affirm. And it was based on principles that we'll call later the principle of non-maleficence, the principle of ends and means. But they did have a sense of objective ethics or objective morality. And that's a whole part of the founding of our Constitution. Now, why do I bring these two things up? Because the notion of inalienable rights cannot stand without a notion of objective truth and objective ethics. But if you have a notion of objective truth and objective ethics, then the principle of inalienable rights is as obvious as can possibly be. And furthermore, If the principle of inalienable rights is correct, no one, but no one, can consistently maintain a pro-abortion position, a pro-active euthanasia position. It's just simply not possible. We have to get to the bottom of this then. The very notion of inalienable rights, the very notion of an objective justice depends upon these principles. Now, in order to restore this in an accessible way, I've published this book, 10 Universal Principles. But what you need to know in order to defend these principles, I'm going to try and do in this little talk with you today. But the key thing is, if you want more detail, you want the footnotes, you want to see where did this occur in the Constitution, where did this occur in the Dred Scott decision, where does this occur in the Roe v. Wade decision, get this book by Ignatius Press, 10 Universal Principles. For the moment, though, let me just kind of proceed to what I'm going to call a little excursus into objective truth and objective goodness or ethics, and then we're going to get right into the principle of justice in alienable rights, and you will see almost automatically the parallels that exist between all of these things and our pro-life position. One more point to add. We shouldn't feel alone. This has happened in history before. It's happened with the defense of the Indians in the New World. There was a Dominican priest by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas that we'll talk about in a moment. And he tried to defend the Indians against an adversary by the name of Sepulveda, who really tried to justify the genocide of the Indians and the enslavement of the Indians on the basis of an inferiority argument, basically saying that these people were subhuman, that they were savages, and this would justify slavery and genocide. But already you must see the parallels. We're already justifying a genocide by saying that preborn human beings are not human. They're not fully human, but they are, as we'll see in a moment. Any notion of objective truth will tell you that they are. And then, of course, we know in our own history the tragic time when the Supreme Court unanimously decided in the Dred Scott decision that black human beings, why, they were savages and they didn't deserve human rights. Instead, they should be, according to the words of the Supreme Court, subjugated to the superior race. And you go, how could the Supreme Court of the United States make this kind of incredible decision? I'll tell you how. By ignoring the notion of inalienable rights and undermining the notion of inalienable rights. But how do you do that? You do it by undermining objective ethics and undermining objective truth, and then giving a series of bogus subjective arguments which look great to the outside observer, but kill the culture and, of course, kill justice for black human beings on the basis of nothing more than sophistry. Why, that sounds very familiar indeed. It sounds like the Roe versus Wade decision. It sounds like the majority of our Supreme Court. And we're going to see remarkable parallels between the travesty of Dred Scott and, of course, the Roe v. Wade decision, the travesty of the abortion decision. We're also going to see remarkable parallels between Sepulveda's defense of the savagery of the Indians and the justification of their slavery and genocide, and the very same quote-unquote logic that pertains to the Roe versus Wade decision. You know, the abolitionists were made to feel in the same way like they were naive. The abolitionists who opposed slavery, they were the restrictors of the property rights of Southern gentlemen. But for all intents and purposes, they were right. They grounded their arguments in a notion of objective ethics, in a notion of objective truth. And as it turns out, who was naive? Indeed. Who was the restrictor of rights. Who took away rights? The abolitionists? Or rather, did they give them and protect them? Oh yes, history has its strange quirks, and we're involved in a mega quirk in this Roe versus Wade decision. And it seems so long as we will forget our roots as Americans, forget the notion of inalienable rights and the intentions of the writers and the founders of this country and the Constitution, so long as we enter into our blissful forgetfulness, we too can be the carriers of the new slavery, and we can be the defenders of the new Dred Scott decision. Or should we prevent our culture from being involved in such a travesty? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin with 3 quick principles of objective truth. I'm not going to be able to develop these very much with you today because I want to get to objective ethics and to the notion of justice and inalienable rights, because that's where the meat is going to be contained for the purposes of this lecture. Go to the book 10 Universal Principles if you'd like a little bit more on these 3 principles of truth. But we need a notion of objective truth. I go into classes all the time, especially freshman or sophomore classes. You say to the class, hey, how many of you guys think that all opinions are just about equally valid? Half the class will raise their hand automatically and go, why do you think that? Well, everybody has an opinion. There's some truth in every opinion. But are they all equally good? Or can we say to the person sitting next to us, your opinion is not as good as my opinion, without being offensive, because you have a reason for making that statement? Isn't there some rationale, some criteria that we can use? And as it turns out, there is, of course. And it goes back 2,400 years to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. In brief, they had 3 principles. I'm just going to do these very quickly with you. Number 1, they had the principle of complete explanation. They had the principle, number 2, of non-contradiction. And thirdly, the principle of objective evidence. Those principles still exist with us today. And by the way, I think every court uses them in some fashion. It's amazing that the Supreme Court ignored them in the Roe versus Wade decision, the Dred Scott decision, but alas, I think it was an ignorance of convenience, if you know what I mean. The key thing then is, what is the principle of complete explanation? In short, it simply means that the opinion that explains the most data wins. So, for example, I could go to that same class and say, okay then, so Newton was just as right as Einstein, right? And the class would say, no, Einstein's general relativity is a much better explanation of the universe as we know it than Newton's Principia Mathematica, because it explains so much more. It explains so much more. So you mean there's data that Newton didn't explain? Oh yeah, he didn't even know about the Michelson-Morley experiment. He didn't know about the atomic clocks experiment. He didn't know, gosh, if you had shot up a rocket ship to hit the moon on the basis of Newton's principles, it would have missed by 1,000 miles. So you're saying Einstein had a better opinion? Yeah, that's what we're saying. And there it is. The principle of most complete explanation. Yes, Einstein's theory explains hundreds of data sets that Newton didn't even know about. Now, you can't blame Newton for not knowing about them because they weren't there yet. But that's not important. What's important is Einstein's opinion is better because it explains more. Therefore, as pro-life people, we should never, not even for a second, abandon this notion of complete explanation when we're talking about personhood. More on that in a moment. We're talking about ethics. More on that in a moment. Because we do have a more complete explanation. We are not left to lobotomize everything we have known in ethics as objective for years. We don't have to do this. We can bring it back to our culture, unabashedly, unashamedly bring it back to our culture. But hang on for a moment. Second point, the principle of non-contradiction. That just means that John can't be 6'3" and not 6'3" in the same respect at the same place and time. See what I'm saying? In other words, you can't have a square circle of the same area in the same respect at the same place and time. You can go back and forth really quick, square circle, square circle, but you can't have a square circle in the same respect, same place and time with the same area. Can't be done. And of course, John can't be 6'3" and not 6'3" in the same. So he can't be 6'3" and 6'4" in the same respect at the same place and time. Can't do it. Now, why is that so important? Because whenever you have contradictions, you know they're wrong. Whenever you have a contradiction, you know that there is an invalid proposition or statement in that argument, which means, quite frankly, you should seriously discount it. So, for example, if the Supreme Court should say to you, gosh, there's no precedent whatsoever for the personhood of pre-born human beings, of a fetus. There's just no precedent for that. And of course, they restrict the data set so far that you eliminate really obvious things like, well, gee, for all those years of constitutional law and common law, you can just open up any law dictionary or any constitutional dictionary, and there will be the personhood of a pre-born human being, of a human fetus. By the way, that personhood gave them the right to inherit. How can non-human beings inherit exactly? How do you do that? Oh, by the way, do you realize that pre-born human beings can sue for an injury that happened to them in utero? How could that be if they weren't human in the womb, but then they could sue later outside the womb? How could the non-human sue for injuries done to him or her in utero? I mean, how is this possible unless they're human? And the list goes on. So there's a problem here. We call that a contradiction. On the one hand, the court wants to defend the rights of inheritance, wants to defend the right to sue, wants to even give criminal charges to someone who kills a pregnant lady and turns out that the fetus is killed. Maybe the mom survives, but the fetus is killed. You can be criminally prosecuted for this. That was the case for centuries. How can the court tell us that there's no precedent for the personhood of human beings in utero? How is this possible? It's a contradiction. I'm just saying. The obvious. Third, there's this other thought that we have, and the thought is essentially that when we're looking for evidence, we really want objective evidence. And what does that mean? That means evidence that we can all equally share. So, in brief, we have two kinds of objective evidence that you and I could share equally. For example, I could turn around and say, okay, there's a book in my hand. And if you were here in this room with me, you could say, sure, of course. Who's arguing? Sensorial evidence. That's good. It's publicly corroboratable. We can share it together. There's not going to be a dispute unless you have eyes that are worse than mine, and I seriously doubt that. Of course, there are other possibilities too. By the way, that's called a posteriori evidence, sensorial evidence. We also can have evidence too that we call a priori evidence. It's based on non-contradiction, our second principle. All mathematics, all metaphysics, right? It's based on a priori evidence. So if I came up to you and I said, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and you say, prove it, I could, no problem. I can give you that proof in 2.5 seconds. And by the way, you can prove the existence of God in exactly the same fashion So that if you deny the conclusion, you will get into irreconcilable contradictions of fact or contradictions, what's called an intrinsic contradiction. It is a fact that a squared plus b squared is not c cubed. It is a fact. And you can prove it by a non-contradictory method, by showing that you will contradict all the initial axioms of mathematics if you say that a squared plus b squared equals c cubed. By the way, it's not just proving God's existence or proving, mathematics. I mean, there's so many other uses for this a priori and a posteriori evidence. We use it in the law all the time. There was a very funny incident where the Indiana State Legislature decided that 3.14159 was too big of a number for pi. Just simply say it's 3.2. And so they declared it by fiat of legislation. But you see, that declaration contradicted this objective a priori evidence. You had all these poor mathematicians out there looking at them going, you must be out of your mind. If you declare pi to be 3.12, all these bridges are going to fall down. This is the most absurd thing that's ever been done in legislative history. Well, it really wasn't. We've had a bunch of greater absurdities. The Roe v. Wade, in my opinion, is much more absurd. It's a judicial decision, but same thought. But the point remains, we have a way of getting to the objectivity of truth. So 3 things that we want to remember. By the way, today we do have objective evidence that a preborn human being is a human being. By the way, you know it from what's called a DNA sequencer. And that DNA sequencer will tell you, without question, it'll give you the full human genome, this whole map of the entire genetic structure of that human being, which is a single-celled zygote, not even implanted. You can take its genetic code and 3 things will be obvious to you. Number 1, it's a human being and nothing other than a human being. Not even a closely related primate or maybe a mammal like a dolphin with high intelligence. Not even close. It's a human being. Number 2, it's a unique human being. There's no other human being just like it. There has never been another human being just like this human being. That genetic code, it's unique. And number 3, give me enough time and I'll construct that entire genetic code and I will be able to tell you pretty much what that human being, all things being equal, not having a car accident or something like that and so forth, something that intrudes on its normal growth patterns. I can tell you pretty much what they're going to look like. I can tell you pretty much whether they're going to be athletic or they're not going to be athletic. You can even tell, frankly, whether they're going to be a brainiac or not. The point I'm trying to get to is, of course, they're human. They're knowable. They're unique. And that genetic code, that full human genome, is in a zygote, in a cell which is going to develop. It's a metabolizing cell which will develop into a full human being when given the chance. Now, it's very interesting that in the Roe versus Wade decision, there is a declaration that nobody knows when, the personhood begins. In other words, personhood being associated with a human being that's deserving of protection under the law. It's very interesting that this claim has now been superseded. And for all intents and purposes, it's never been reconsidered by the Supreme Court. That the entire rationale for this decision is totally bogus. We now have objective evidence beyond any doubt of the unique human and only human being. I don't think anyone can doubt it. It's a living being It's human and only human, and it's a unique human. Hey, what in the world do you need besides this as a necessary criterion? Present in a single-celled human zygote. But I'll just leave it at that. Let's go right to the ethics of the matter. Now we start getting into the meat of human freedoms. But remember, freedoms have got to be based on truth, objective truth. Objective truth that is not riddled with contradictions and all kinds of sophistries, a running from the objective evidence, and of course, at the end of the day, completely incomplete explanations. First and foremost, we have three principles of ethics. Principle of non-maleficence, talk about it in a moment. Principle of consistent ends and means. Principle of full human potential. Let's just talk about them for a moment, because of course, they're the ground that all inalienable rights and justice will stand on. Let's begin first with the principle of non-maleficence. And why begin there? Because it is the most fundamental principle in ethics. If the principle of non-maleficence falls, all the other principles are going to fall. And just remember, non-male, right? Maleficence, non-male, not evil. Don't commit a harm, don't commit an evil against another. So sometimes we simplify this as the silver rule. And many of you, of course, learned about the silver rule versus the golden rule. But just a quick reminder, the golden rule is what we'll call ethical maximalism. The sky's the limit. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do the good for others that you would have done to you. On the other hand, we've got the silver rule, and that's ethical minimalism. That's the foundational principle of all the rest of ethics. If it topples, ethics will topple in our culture. It's the one with the nots. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Don't do a harm to others that you don't want done to you. You get the point, essentially. Don't do any unnecessary harms, but if a harm is unavoidable, then minimize it. Don't do any unnecessary harms, but if a harm is unavoidable, minimize it. You can see why this is going to be the foundation of all ethics. Number one, everybody agrees on it. I can get a brute utilitarian to agree that this is the first principle of ethics. I can get a principle-based deontologist to agree that this is the first principle of ethics. Everything else is going to topple without it. So what's my point? My point is the Supreme Court has completely ignored this. And this was done in the Dred Scott decision. This was done in the decision to enslave the Indians in the New World in the so-called genocide. Now, let's just kind of go through why that is the case. Remember now, the golden rule is ethical maximalism. That can't be required of people that you do the goods for them. Jesus advocates it for us, but you can't require it of people that they do the good that you would want done to them. But you can require that they avoid unnecessary harms. And by the way, if you know someone who thinks that they have to do unnecessary harm to you in order to be fulfilled, my thought would be run, Bambi, run. Because at the end of the day, you're dealing with a sociopath who's incapable of empathy and has no conscience. It requires very little empathy to agree with the silver. Even Thomas Hobbes thought without the silver rule, life would be brutish, ugly, and short. In our culture, we can do this as a single objective moral or ethical principle. We can do this. This is not going to be an is-ought problem. Avoid unnecessary harms to others. Now, why do I say this with respect to the three decisions at hand? Number one, because of course, take a look at all of them. It was decided on the basis of uncertainty that harm should be done to the Indians, to the black man, and to now preborn human beings. So we notice straight across the board that on the basis of indecision, unclarity, seemingly not being able to get enough evidence that we have a human being here or a full human being here, the courts in all three cases decided better to do the harm than not to do the harm. Now that's a problem, of course, because at the end of the day, if you decide to do the harm and then you later find out, oh my gosh, that was a human being. Those black people that we decided to enslave, gee, they were really full human beings. The harm is already done. The principle of non-maleficence is already violated. And you are responsible, Supreme Court. You're responsible for every black family broken up. You're responsible for the enslavement and the death and the unjust death of thousands of black people. You are responsible for it. And Supreme Court, if you find out, and now we know that there's a full human being present, if you know for certain that you have a full human genome and a metabolizing human being in a zygote which will develop into a full human being if you don't obstruct it or kill that human being, then you are responsible for the millions of deaths caused by this harm. Why? Because it's unnecessary. It's not unavoidable. No one has to kill preborn infants in order to protect anyone's so-called rights. Not necessary. And even if you remain uncertain to this day, if you say, I deny all the genetic evidence, I want to separate the notion of human personhood from human being, you should still be uncertain enough never to kill what could be a human being simply on the basis of convenience or, in some senses, the overcoming of social distress. Because it's unjust, it's a violation of the principle of non-maleficence, it is completely unethical, and to try and justify it with any bogus argument, any sophistry whatsoever, it's going to undermine our culture. It's going to undermine all of ethics within our culture. So you kill the human beings for which you are responsible, and then you turn right around and you say in the same breath, you undermine in the same breath all of the ethical principles upon which stand upon the principle of non-maleficence. It's horrible. By the way, the same thing happened when the Spanish court decided in favor of Sepulveda instead of deciding in favor of Las Casas. At the end of the day, you know, they killed millions of Indians, went right into the reductions. These Indians had absolutely no immunities whatsoever, went in to go and enslave them. They ran off into the jungles if they could escape, but they had no immunities. By the end of the day, they killed millions. And Sepulveda admitted at the end, even though he said at the present moment they were savages, he said he couldn't determine whether they would become fully human in the future. Great. You can't do this and still have an ethical culture left. We are at the brink, and like the abolitionists, we should stand up to this injustice and keep fighting it, because it is so fundamental, it is so wrong, and every attempt to defend it undermines ethics within our culture again and again. I'm just going to skip over the principle of consistent ends and means right now, but you all know that the end does not justify the means. And just in real brief form, that means you just can't be using some kind of a harmful means to get to a good end. right? What it means is, you know, you could use a harmful means sometimes to prevent a greater harm, but you can't use a harmful means to get to a good end, which doesn't prevent a greater harm. So if Mao Zedong decides in order to have the Cultural Revolution, a few million people are going to have to die, or the Khmer Rouge decides in order to get back to the great agrarian utopian society, we'll have to put all these people on the farms and it turns into the killing fields for millions, you can't say that was particularly good. Because at the end of the day, you can't kill millions of people in order to get to an economic good. The economic good, what does this, how can that possibly justify the unjust death of the millions? It's the same thing with the abortion issue and the euthanasia issue. With respect to the abortion issue, clearly, you can't say, I'm protecting the rights of women, but I have to kill millions of preborn human beings in order to do that. It's very nice that you want to protect, reproductive rights, which is a liberty claim for women, but the cost is millions upon millions of lives. There's, as far as I know, and we'll discuss this in detail in a moment, all liberty rights are subordinated to life rights. And why is that? Because of the necessity criterion, which we'll be talking about. And the necessity criterion simply says this, that the right which is necessary for the possibility of another right, that right must be more important, more fundamental than the right which depends on it. So, for example, if the right to life is necessary for the very possibility of the right to liberty, the right to liberty has to be more important, more fundamental than the right to liberty. A woman's claim to freedom over her own body and justification of reproductive rights. It has to be. And by the way, is the right to life necessary for the very possibility of the right to liberty? Yeah, I mean, if you're dead, your liberty rights are a moot question. This is not a problem. By the way, in the Dred Scott decision, it was the very same violation of the hierarchy of rights. Because after all, the right to property, as Locke very well knew, is subordinate to the right to liberty. And why is that? If I say to black people, hey, you get to own all the property you want, but I get to own you. I get to own your property by default because I own you. So of course your property rights are a moot question if somebody can own you outright, if your liberty rights are violated. You get the point. But these reversals of the priority of rights, again the sophistries emerge, the bogus arguments emerge. We have to be as courageous as the abolitionists, courageous as a Wilberforce, to get out there and continuously defend what must be called common sense applied to the great universal principles, and not let our country get away with such bogus arguments that just would shame a Philosophy 101 student. But let's get to right to the heart of things. This is called the principle of full human potential. It's our third ethical principle. And why call this an ethical principle? Because it really matters who gets into the human category, whether or not you're going to apply ethics to that person, so-called. Personhood, then, is the means by which we classify whether somebody is worthy of protection under the law, whether somebody is worthy of having their rights to life, liberty, and property protected by each of us individually. So that notion of personhood is a really important notion. And so you don't have a complete ethics unless you tell who's deserving of ethical treatment, who's deserving of legal treatment. And that comes under the notion of personhood. Now, by the way, this personhood has always been associated with, objectively, with human being since time immemorial. So for all intents and purposes, even when personne in French and archaic French was actually associated, right, with a human being, and a human being was deserving of protection under the law. You can see from the 1500s onwards, you can see personhood was always associated with human being. Today we have an objective criterion for a human being, namely a full human genome in a metabolizing zygote, human zygote, which of course is going to, it's all that's required to have, as you can see, in 9 months, you're going to have a post-utero human being, and that human being will find its fullest development probably around 17 years of age, and when it's fully mature, and of course the inevitable decline begins. Now the point, of course, is for Las Casas was you have to always interpret this notion of personhood in the fullest possible way. Now, Las Casas has a slightly different problem than we do in the pro-life movement, but in a way it's the same. You see, when Sepulveda was arguing for the enslavement of the Indians in the Spanish court, his argument was simply this: the Indians are savages, and therefore we have the right to own them and enslave them and use them as we please, because they are not full human beings. The third consequence, of course, is, well, if they resist slavery, you have the right to kill them or send them into a distressed situation in which they will be killed, because they're not full human beings. Now, this kind of bloodthirsty treatment, you say, well, that's not what goes on in abortion. It most certainly does. That's exactly what goes on in an abortion. And here is the progression that we see. Oh, by the way, also in the Dred Scott decision, also see it right in the Roe v. Wade. But now, how did, just for a second, Sepulveda try and justify that these Indians are savages? I mean, how did they do it? They did it this way. Or Sepulveda does it this way. He says, look, I mean, Europeans, they have a little bit higher math. They have a little bit more nuanced architecture. Their music is a little bit more nuanced. Never mind that the Indians in 100 years had aqueducts, had built great agrarian farms with irrigation. Never mind that they had composed their own music and their own musical instruments, that they had built cathedrals that rivaled the cathedrals. Read this book by C.J. McNaspy, the Reductions of Paraguay, right? Just read it, and you look at it and you go, they weren't that far behind. So Sepulveda is coming up and he's saying, you cannot say this. They will be just like us. And Sepulveda responds, he says, nay, nay. Right now, at this very moment, we have superiority to the Indians. Never mind what they will become in 10 years. We are not interested. And Las Casas says this right back in return. If you take no interest in what they will become in their full human potential, then you take no interest in the justice that belongs to them in the future as full human beings. And if you take no interest what they will become as full human beings in the future, then you take no interest in their justice as full human beings in the present. And if that is the case, you, sir, violate the principle of non-maleficence on a grand scale and convince everyone else to do so. How can you live with yourself? You are the gross violator of justice. You are the gross violator of personhood. You are the gross violator of the principle of non-maleficence. I say the same charge to the majority in the Supreme Court. You are responsible, because at the end of the day, this preborn human being in 9 months will be a postborn human being. That human being will not reach full development until they're probably 17 or 18 years old. That is true. And they will be in a developmental stage all the way along the line. that 1-year-old, that 1-day-old human being is not any less human than the 2-year-old. And the 2-year-old not any less human. Why? Because humanity is not decided by growth. Human being is not decided by reaching the full potential. Human being, as Las Casas says, is determined by the full human potential in the future. Whether it's an Indian reaching the culmination of culture, or whether it is a preborn human being awaiting 9 months development or 18 years of development, it makes no difference. They are fully human now, and you must base their rights now on the rights that they would have as full human beings in the future. And development, historical development, is nothing more than a historical accident. And anyone who tells you any different is lying. It is a bogus argument. And of course, it could never support any form of justice, because waiting on the brink is a violation, a gross violation of the principle of non-maleficence. But these are the things that we are dealing with. These are matters of great moment, matters of great principle. And those principles have been violated. And we cannot be silent and just accept this kind of degradation of our cultures and our principles within this society. Something has got to change. The abolitionists believed it. They kept fighting it. We should fight it and fight it and fight it just as they did, realizing maybe after 100 years, common sense will prevail. And indeed, it took just about that long, from the time of the Civil War onward, to get to the point where we are today. So, let us move beyond the principle of full human potential for just a moment, and move then to this principle of justice and inalienable rights. Just in short, what is an inalienable right, and where does it come from? An inalienable right comes from yet another priest. In this case, it was a Jesuit, a man by the name of Francisco Suarez. And Suarez had been a lawyer prior to becoming a Jesuit, and Suarez was looking for a way of universalizing justice for everyone. Now remember, justice is giving every human being their due, right? If you do a job for me, I want to pay you a just wage for the job you do, etc., so that every human being then, gets their just deserts. And that's the idea of justice. But what happened was, of course, we got to this point where we needed to universalize justice, because the power of some of these despots was, turned against the citizenry. And by the way, if you want to read something like Machiavelli's Prince, just to get an idea of the atmosphere that's kind of surrounding Suarez, that's a good book to start with. But the idea is Suarez wants to universalize rights. And so he comes up with this idea. He takes the Latin word justitia, and he just clips it to a particle jus, the first part of it. And by doing this, he makes it kind of a thing which can belong to everyone. And he says each and every person has these rights that belong to them. In other words, these are like property that belongs to me by my very human nature, by my very human existence. This belongs to me. And so if we just take this for just a moment, you can see what he's up to. If you're a human being, and how do we define human being? Let's go back to Las Casas. Everyone who has a full human potential, everyone who can develop into a full human being, no matter what the historical stage is, should be considered not only a human being, but a person deserving of these rights. So they're not just deserving of the rights, they have the rights, says Suarez. No government ever gave them these rights. And therefore, no government can ever take them away. They're inalienable. They're rights that belong to people by their very nature. The very fact that they're a human being, the very fact that they have a full human genome, enough. Doesn't matter whether they're single-celled, 18 years old, doesn't matter. The point is, you have intrinsic to your being, these rights. Now, what are those rights? What's a right anyway? What's an inalienable right? An inalienable right can't be any kind of right, like a reproductive right or a right to steal things or whatever rights the Supreme Court wants to declare. Those are called extrinsic rights. An inalienable right, an intrinsic right, belongs to you by your very nature or existence. What does it have to be? What's required for justice, simple justice, to be done to you. So there are always going to be the minimum requirements for justice. And every human being has a right to be treated justly insofar as they are human. That's the Suarezian logic. Now here's the point. Well, what do you need in order to be human? What do you need to have minimum justice done to you? Well, first of all, you have to be alive. And if people have the right to kill you, that should be considered unjust. Duh. Number two, you have the right to liberty. People can't go around owning you. That's not right. Every human being has to have some ownership over themselves. So you have to have basic liberty rights. And finally, you have to have property rights. Why do you have to have property rights? Because what Suarez recognized is that if you didn't have property rights, then somebody could treat you like an indentured servant. So if you have to come to the Spitzer store and you can only be hired by the Spitzer company and you have to work for what Spitzer declares is your wages and so forth and so on, you are in indentured servitude. Okay, you get the point. What's my point? Locke reads about this. And when Locke sees this, he's enamored. He says, oh my gosh, this is the solution to all my problems. Why would it be the solution to all of his problems? For a simple reason that now you can't have a tyranny of the majority. In other words, a vote is very imperfect because a plebiscite or a vote means that 51% could commit severe injustice to the other 49%, and there'd be no getting out of it. But Suarez and Locke are saying, no, there's a bottom line. There's something more fundamental than a vote, more fundamental than a government system, more fundamental than a judiciary system. What is it? Justice. What kind of justice? The justice that is absolutely simple, the kind that is required in order for human beings to be human. Life, liberty, and property. That's why those three rights alone are inalienable. You get the point. Now, Locke sees this, incorporates it right into the second treatise on government. I don't have to tell you, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson are reading Locke, and they know this is the answer to our problems. This is going to be in the Declaration of Independence. This is going to be the prologue to the Declaration of Independence. And of course they had to use inalienable rights as the ground of their claim. Because of course if they tried to use extrinsic rights, the only extrinsic rights that were coming to the colonies were declared by the British government. They weren't stupid. They knew, hey, wait a minute, that's not justice. There's something that the British government has to be responsible to, something more fundamental than the edicts of the British government. It's the fundamental requirements of justice that are marked out in inalienable rights. So they begin, we hold these truths to be self-evident, not declared in a constitution, but self-evident we hold these rights. And then it goes on to specify that these rights are the right to life, the right to liberty, and of course they change property to the pursuit of happiness. That's a whole other subject which I'm not going to get into today, but the key thought is there. The fundamental rights for justice to be done to every human being are declared as inalienable rights. They're declared to be self-evident. They don't need any governmental declaration, and therefore no government can take them away. Now, all you have to do is go to the Constitutional Convention. You've got this war going on between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And of course, they decide at the end of the day not to put the inalienable rights into the Constitution. Did you ever ask yourself this question? Why in the world didn't the inalienable rights show up in the Constitution? I mean, did they have a huge oversight or something? No, they did not. They purposefully and intentionally excluded them. because the Constitution begins with this: we, the people of the United States, and then there's a big bunch of declarations. It's a declared thing by a governmental institution, namely a constitutional convention, and they didn't want the inalienable rights to be touched by that, because that might have implied that a government could take them away because they declared them into existence. They kept them pure. They kept them in the Declaration. They kept them as self-evident writ. They kept them as the foundational principle of justice for our country. And that's, those founding fathers, they were very smart people. Now, you take a look at what happened in Dred Scott and Roe v. Wade, and it will appall you. Because the first thing you will notice in the Dred Scott decision is that inalienable rights were never even taken cognizance of. And you will notice in the Roe versus Wade decision, no recourse is made to an inalienable right at all. Oh yes, there's a reference made to the liberty rights of the woman, but it's the liberty rights as translated by the Supreme Court, not the fundamental right to autonomy over their own being. So of course, you know, already you see a problem, but the word inalienable rights never shows up. And of course, they couldn't do this. They couldn't do this at all in either the Dred Scott decision or the Roe v. Wade decision, because if they did, it would be so obvious right away that the right to life was higher than the right to liberty. And of course, right away they would notice, you know, that we're ignoring the greatest inalienable right claim to the preborn human being, or the liberty claim of the black human being over against the property rights of the white man. So they couldn't do that. Instead, they declared that the only rights that were out there were extrinsic rights, constitutional rights. And then they went out and they did something really bogus. They said, we're going to search the Constitution and the constitutional precedents to see if we can find that black human beings were deserving of rights, or that preborn human beings were deserving of rights. Now get this, everybody. After they've ignored inalienable rights, they search for the constitutional rights, and of course, they don't find any. Why? Because there's no case precedents that are required, and the constitutional fathers were not thinking of this problem when they made the Constitution. It would be like searching for America on a map that existed before Columbus. How dumb can you get? But of course, it has to be dumb. It has to be bogus, because we're doing something fundamentally unjust and in violation of the principle of non-maleficence. And then it gets even better. When they find out that the Constitution doesn't have the rights, they judge from that the rights don't exist. Isn't that a good one? That's a logical violation, everybody. It's a violation of of pure and simple logic. Look, you can always say, if a right is in the Constitution, then a right exists, no problem. But you can't say, if a right's not in the Constitution, the right does not exist. That's called negating the antecedent. It's a fundamental logical fallacy. And even more importantly, it interprets silence. Silence means nothing. If the Constitution is silent about a right, it does not mean that the right does not exist. The whole thing is filled with flaws and bogusness. At the end of the day, what are we fighting for? Oh yes, we're fighting for the lives of these preborn human beings. Yes, we are fighting that. We are fighting for fundamental religious liberty. And make no mistake about it, that religious liberty is responsible in so many ways for the natural rights which we have today, which have been, of course, quote unquote, baptized by the secular society. But we're fighting to maintain those principles. We're fighting to maintain those rights. Rights that have been just violated by logical errors, interpretations of silence to mean the non-existence of right, the complete forgetting of inalienable rights, which is a culpable sin of omission of a first class, and the principles of the violation of the principle of non-maleficence, the violation of the principle of full human person, everything upon which our country was founded, just simply summarily ignored. And at the end of the day, what can we do? I think we can continue to point this out. Pro-lifers are not the naive ones. We are not the ones who are restricting rights or God help us, taking away rights from human beings. We are protecting the most fundamental rights of our citizens, protecting the principle of non-maleficence, trying to restore a notion of objective ethics and objective truth to our culture, protecting the notion of full human being so we can avoid travesties like this in the future and keep our culture moving toward the good. And at the end of the day, that makes all the difference, and it is worth it. Thank you for hanging in there with me and this impassioned plea. So much more information can be garnered from the book in detail, but for the time being, let us ask the Lord to continue to bless our efforts so that we will never give up, so that we can protect these principles, and in so doing, protect the full human beings around us. Thank you.